Probably started by telling you something straightforward. Because whenever my name comes up in the middle of a political storm, the people like to twist it in the way that makes the most noise. I'm Elon Musk, and for most of my life, I've stayed on my side of the line. I talk about technology, I talk about innovation, and I talk about long-term thinking. I don't shout. I don't dramatize. And Forum and I certainly don't wake up in the morning looking for a fight with politicians. But this time I watched something unfold that even I couldn't ignore. It wasn't just a political story. It was a story about systems, efficiency, and data transparency. And when you see resources being wasted on a massive scale while real problems go unsolved, it always draws people like me into the conversation. Now, to be completely transparent, I didn't get on a stage, bang my fist, and yell about political donors. That's the kind of theater you see on TV, not in Austin. What I did was apply first principle analysis to something I've been observing for months. When you turn political campaigns into inefficient resource allocation systems, the same people who could be funding real innovation end up trapped in cycles of political waste. Let me explain exactly how this started for me. Actuators in reviewing some data on capital efficiency in different sectors when someone on my team brought me a report on campaign spending. Initially, I didn't pay much attention. Politics isn't my area of expertise and forearm. But when I saw the numbers, something immediately caught my attention. The math simply didn't make sense. You had enormous resources being directed to campaigns with conversion rates that, frankly, any startup would shut down if it showed similar results. And I started to wonder, where exactly was this money going? Who were the real beneficiaries of this system? Because clearly it wasn't the candidates who were losing crucial elections. Before I get into the details, let me tell you the moment I knew I had a problem. I received a call from someone close to the Washington political circle. This person told me something that, frankly, I should have realized sooner. They said that the big donors weren't really investing in electoral victories with hand and forearm. They were investing in maintaining a system that benefited consultants, media agencies, and political intermediaries. It was basically a wealth transfer scheme disguised as a democratic process. And that immediately made me think of something I experienced at Tesla and Forum. When you have a system where incentives are misaligned with desired outcomes, you're always going to have a massive waste of resources. In my experience building companies, learned that data transparency is fundamental to efficiency. You can't optimize what you clearly measure. And when I started analyzing the money flows in political campaigns, I realized there were deliberate layers of opacity. Donors writing checks to PAYCs, transferring to super PAYCs, hiring consultants who subcontract agencies that outsource production. It was like looking at a financial transfer network specifically designed to obscure where the money actually ended up. CFO of a real company would look at this and immediately identify it as a system designed to maximize waste, not results. A few weeks later, I started getting strange calls. People I'd never spoken to before who represent the interests of major donors, others identifying themselves as political consultants. The tone was always the same. They wanted to know if I was planning to speak publicly about campaign efficiency or the allocation of political resources. One of these conversations particularly struck me. The guy on the other end of the line said something like, Look, Elon, you understand rockets and electric cars, but politics is different. There are deals here that you don't understand. And I replied, actually, I understand perfectly. You just described exactly the kind of inefficient system I spend my whole life trying to optimize. The difference is that at space, if I waste resources like that, I won't get to Mars. In politics, apparently, you can waste resources indefinitely and still keep the system running. This is where things got really interesting for me. What I always do when I want to understand a complex system, mapping the data flows, who was donating to whom, when, in what amounts, and most importantly, what were the measurable results of those donations. And what I discovered was fascinating from a systems analysis point of view. With hand and forearm, you had a relatively small group of ultra-wealthy donors funding multiple candidates simultaneously, often candidates who were competing against each other. From a first principle point of view, this doesn't make sense if the goal is to maximize electoral success. But it makes perfect sense if the goal is to maintain a system where you have influence regardless of who wins. Let me explain why this matters from a technical standpoint. In any efficient system, you want to minimize energy loss and maximize useful output. When I analyze a production line at Tesla, I look for points where energy is being wasted on heat or friction instead of being converted into useful movement. The political financing system I observed was basically a giant heat sink. Massive amounts of capital were being converted into consultant fees, advertising spend, and administrative overhead, with very little energy actually reaching its intended destination, which was supposedly electoral success for the funded candidates. It was like trying to go to Mars, but 90% of the rocket's fuel being consumed by bureaucratic overhead before you even left the launch pad. And then something happened I didn't expect. Trump started losing a series of important races where, based on the numbers I was seeing, he should have had a massive financial advantage, hand and forearm. And I started getting more calls, this time from people much more senior in the political food chain. And forearm. One of these conversations was particularly revealing. The person told me, and forearm. The person told me Hamp was becoming increasingly frustrated with the results he was getting from his major donors. Arm. He was questioning whether the money was actually being used effectively or if it was being diverted for other purposes. And forearm, and I thought, finally, someone asking the obvious questions. Here's what really worries me about this. When you have a political system where massive amounts of resources are being inefficiently allocated, you create opportunity costs that affect everyone. Every dollar wasted on political consultant fees is a dollar not being invested in research and development, in infrastructure, in space exploration, in sustainable energy. From my point of view, a political inefficiency is essentially a tax on humanity's progress. And when I see taxes increasing because people in power don't want to address obvious systemic problems, it frustrates me deeply. In my experience at SpaceX, with hand and forearm, I learned that you can't solve complex problems if you're not willing to challenge existing power structures. When I started SpaceX, everyone told me that space launch was dominated by military contractors who had cozy relationships with government agencies, and that new players couldn't compete. But when you apply first principle thinking to the problem, you realize most of the high I cost came from bureaucratic inefficiencies and a lack of real competition. Political campaign finance seemed to have exactly the same problem. You had entrenched players who benefited from maintaining the status quo, regardless of whether that status quo actually produced good results for the candidates or for voters. Some people close to me suggested I should stay quiet about these observations. They told me that politics is messy and that successful business people would generally avoid commenting on campaign finance because you might unnecessarily make enemies. But I've always believed that if you see a systemic problem causing massive resource misallocation, you have a responsibility to point it out, especially if you have a platform to make your voice heard. This isn't about taking political sides. And Forearm, it's about advocating for efficiency and transparency, and then affects resource allocation on a large scale. And Forearm, what surprised me most was not that there were inefficiencies in the political system, but the degree to which these inefficiencies were being deliberately maintained. When I looked more deeply into the data, I discovered that many of the largest donors were simultaneously funding what appeared to be competing interests.
50 the hand and Forearm.
They were donating to Republican candidates and also funding organizations that were working against those same candidates. From a game theory perspective, this looked like a strategy to maintain influence regardless of the outcome. And Forearm, rather than a strategy to achieve specific policy goals. Effectuators in the Forearm. And I began to understand why Trump was getting frustrated. Imagine if you were the CEO of a company and you discovered that your biggest investors were simultaneously funding your competitors because they believed in your competitors' business plan, because they wanted to ensure they had relationships with whoever ended up in control. With hand and Forearm, you would rightfully question whether those investors were actually committed to your success or if they were just hedging their bets, using your company as a piece in a larger game. Let me give you an image that sums this up perfectly. It's like you're trying to build a rocket to go to Mars with hand and Forearm, but your main funders are simultaneously investing in companies that are actively trying to prevent space exploration, not because they opposed space exploration in principle, but because they want to maintain control over when and how space exploration happens. Eventually, you would realize that those funders weren't actually aligned with your mission. Forearm, regardless of how much money they were providing, here's what I see people missing. Modern politics isn't really about ideological competition between different visions for society, competition for control over resource allocation systems, Forearm. And the people who have figured out how to game those systems aren't necessarily aligned with any particular political outcome. They're aligned with maintaining systems that give them disproportionate influence over how resources are allocated, regardless of who officially holds power. In my experience running companies, I've learned that when you have misaligned incentives, you get predictable results. People optimize for whatever you actually reward, not for whatever you say you want. And Forearm, if you reward consultants based on how much money they spend rather than on the results they deliver,
Forearm,
you get expensive campaigns that don't necessarily win elections. If you reward donors based on access rather than on policy outcomes, you get donors who prioritize maintaining access over achieving specific goals. This reminded me of a situation I experienced in the early days of Tesla. We had some investors who claimed to support electric vehicle development and forearm, but when we needed to make decisions that might cannibalize traditional automotive industry profits, suddenly those investors started pushing for more conservative approaches. Eventually, I realized that their real interest wasn't in revolutionizing transportation, but in controlling how rapidly that revolution happened and ensuring that it benefited existing power structures rather than disrupting them. Quando you shared some Dessa's observations publicly, posts sober political efficiency, e-resource allocation, you apparently touched nerve. I getting calls from people claiming para represent various political interests, some supportive, others not so much. One call particularly stood out para mem. The person, this qua while minha analysis might be technically accurate, bringing attention para S's issues could destabilize important relationships, may maintain political stability. EU responded, see political stability depends on maintaining deliberately inefficient systems. Then maybe stability isn't actually serving public interest. A few weeks later, someone close to Trump contacted me directly. He told me that Trump was increasingly convinced that many of his major donors had agendas that weren't aligned with his political success. He was particularly frustrated with cases where massive expenditures weren't translating into electoral wins. And he wanted to understand if my analysis of campaign finance inefficiencies could help explain what was happening. From my perspective, any organization trying to accomplish specific goals needs para. Ensure its resource allocation systems are optimized para those goals. Save Octem donors who are simultaneously supporting contradictory objectives. You're going para suboptimal results in basic systems engineering. Can't optimize OMA system for multiple conflicting objectives simultaneously. Need para. Choose what you're actually trying para maximize. There are fixuators where my understanding of technology development became relevant to political analysis. In tech and in forearm, we've learned that you need to distinguish between people who are genuinely committed to your mission versus people who are just trying to hedge their positions. Genuine mission alignment shows up in consistent behavior over time, especially when things get challenging. Shows up support that disappears or becomes conditional whenever you encounter real obstacles. Looking back and forum, I realized that political campaign finance has many of the same dynamics as venture capital, but with much worse transparency requirements. In VC, you at least have clear metrics for success and failure, and investors who consistently back failing ventures eventually lose credibility. In political finance, you can be consistently associated with unsuccessful campaigns and still maintain influence, as long as you maintain relationships with right intermediaries. What this taught me was that political systems, like any other complex systems, with hand and forearm, need continuous optimization based on clear metrics and feedback loops. When you have systems where success metrics are deliberately obscured and feedback loops are interrupted by intermediary interests, you inevitably get performance degradation over time. And this affects not just political outcomes, but the entire society's ability to solve important problems efficiently. You started thinking about it in terms to opportunity cost para humanity as uma whole. $1 billion Koi gets inefficiently allocated through political systems represents massive opportunity. Cost in terms of scientific research, why it could have been funded. Infrastructure improvements, Koi could have been built. The technology development, Koi could have accelerated. From civilizational perspective, political inefficiency, essentially break human progress. EU, come say para realize, this wasn't just about Trump or any specific politician. ESO era about fundamental system architecture, Koi was optimized para extract value rather than create it. Walker politician who tried para optimize para actual results rather than para maintaining existing systems would inevitably run into same problems where Trump was encountering. Not about individual corruption, about systemic incentives where reward and efficiency over effectiveness. In my experience with both Tesla and SpaceX, I've learned that you can't solve complex engineering problems without challenging the assumptions underlying existing systems. Sometimes this means questioning relationships that seem stable on the surface, but are actually undermining your core objectives. It's uncomfortable, but it's necessary if you truly want to achieve your stated goals. Quando you see political systems are systematically misallocating resources, while important civilizational challenges go underfunded, you feel same frustration. Way you feel quando you see any inefficient system that's wasting human potential. Whether it's automotive industry resisting electric vehicles, space industry resisting reusable rockets, political industry resisting transparency about resource allocation. Underlying dynamics are similar. Entrenched interests benefit from maintaining status quo, regardless whether qui status quo serves broader human interests. Dexa ut explicar o que eu realmente aprendi com isso. Political analysis, form these systems. Analysis, requires looking at incentive structures rather than declared intentions. People will reliably do whatever qui system incentivizes them para do, regardless do quer they say their goals are. Sivaki want para predict behavior.
At how success
Measured. Rewarded, not at public statements about objectives. In retrospect, Trump's frustration his donor base makes perfect sense from systems analysis perspective. It was treating political donors like investors committed para specific outcomes. Quando in reality, many of them were behaving more like insurance companies hedging against multiple possible futures. Different mental models lead para different expectations. Quando expectations don't match reality, inevitable result. No final das contas, isomi and seno algo fundamental sober relationship between technology, progress, political systems. Technology advances when you have clear objectives, transparent resource allocation, rapid feedback loops, allow for continuous optimization. Political systems advance quando have same things. Quando political systems become optimized para maintaining opacity, preventing feedback loops, they become net drags from technological progress rather than enablers of it. ESO, para people who care about long-term human progress need para care about political system efficiency. Even politics isn't their primary area to focus. If there's one thing I've learned from this, it's that systems analysis skills are transferable across domains. Whether you're analyzing rocket performance or campaign finance efficiency, and fundamental principles about resource optimization, incentive alignment, and feedback loops still apply. When you see systems that are systematically violating those principles, you have a responsibility to point it out, regardless of whether pointing it out is politically convenient. Every moment we spend in unnecessary political turmoil caused by deliberately inefficient systems is time I could be using to guarantee that our species becomes multiplanetary. And that, to me, is what really matters at the end of the day. Political efficiency isn't an end in itself. It's a means to ensure that humanity can focus its resources on solving existential challenges and getting stuck in unnecessarily complex intermediary systems that benefit systems that primarily benefit system administrators rather than system users.